He arrived at the cemetery alone on a cold February morning. No escort, no ceremony, just an old military coat, a folded flag, and a promise that had waited over half a century to be fulfilled. At first, no one noticed. Then, one person stopped, and just a few hours later, all of Jefferson Barracks stood in silence, watching his footsteps. Come along and follow his journey. Welcome to NT, where everyday kindness becomes unforgettable. Let's begin this journey together. Frank Delaney lived alone in a modest house tucked away in St. Charles, a quiet town about an hour's drive from downtown St. Louis. The house had just 2 rooms, a front yard with a few golden mums and a weathered wooden mailbox, faded by sun and time. Neighbors knew him as kind old Mr. Frank who feeds the stray cats. The mailman often saw him sitting on the porch with a newspaper in one hand and coffee in the other, sipping from a chipped mug that read Semper Fi. But what most didn't know was that Frank had once been a Marine, and he had survived a battle that many never came home from. He enlisted in 1966 at the age of 26, not for glory, but because his older brother had died in World War II, and Frank had always felt that duty ran deep in their bloodline. He was deployed to Vietnam, stationed near Khe Sanh, where the jungle rains never seemed to stop, where artillery echoed through the night, and darkness often meant silence and danger. In his unit was a man named Isaac Monroe, quick on his feet, funny when he wanted to be, but unusually serious whenever he talked about his family. The two grew close, like brothers. Isaac used to talk about the hills of Texas where he grew up. Frank spoke of a quiet lake in Missouri where he hoped to rebuild an old fishing dock once he got back. They lived together, fought together, and eventually parted ways on a morning soaked in blood and smoke. It was a spring morning in 1968 when Isaac fell, and in his final moments, with his uniform soaked in red, he held onto Frank's hand and said only one thing: "If you make it out, place a flag for me every year. Don't let them forget me." Frank made it out. Isaac didn't. In the years after the war, Frank went just about everywhere. He worked odd jobs, mechanic, warehouse watchman, then retired early when his health began to fail. But there was one thing he never gave up on: finding where Isaac had been laid to rest. Every time he moved houses, Frank packed up the same small wooden box. Inside were black and white photos of 2 young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, a few faded letters, and a little notebook. In it, he wrote the same line, year after year: "Still haven't found him, but I won't forget." He once traveled to a cemetery in Texas following a lead from a local veterans group, but it was the wrong Isaac. Another year, he mailed a request to the National Archives. No reply. Then, just last year, while browsing alone in a local library, a young librarian helped him search an old military database. And there it was: Isaac Monroe, Plot 57, Row D, Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Frank didn't say a word. He simply closed his notebook for the first time in over 50 years and wrote down one line: "Found him." And now, on the exact day Isaac fell, Frank was there. He didn't bring much, just a folded flag, an old military jacket, and a pair of trembling hands, the same hands that had written that promise again and again. Through decades of silence. They say some promises are made just to comfort, said in passing like small kindnesses, but others are born in fire, in a single moment between 2 souls, and not even time, war, or death can erase them. For Frank Delaney, that promise was born in the mist of a February morning in 1968 on a nameless hill near Khe Sanh, a place that would become a firestorm within hours. The shelling began at 5:12 a.m. Frank and Isaac were on the outer line, holding a position with a small squad. No lights, no warning, Just a shrill whistle of incoming rounds, and then the world exploded. Frank was thrown into a crater, his shoulder dislocated, blood soaking through his collar. Before he could catch his breath, he heard a broken voice call out, "Frank, over here!" Isaac lay 10 paces away, one leg torn by shrapnel, his face covered in mud and blood. Despite the pain, he tried to push himself upright and waved Frank over. Frank thought he'd be okay at first, but when he got close, he saw the wound. Deep, lower in the abdomen, worse than he could have imagined. Isaac forced a tired smile, his breath shallow. "Guess I'm missing that baseball game after all." Frank grabbed his hand, tried the radio. Nothing. The line was dead. The rest of their unit had fallen back. There was nothing left to do, just minutes, and a strange quiet between the shelling. Isaac looked up at him, his voice low. "If you make it, promise me one thing. Place a flag for me. Every year, wherever I'm buried. Don't let them forget, that's all." Frank couldn't speak. He only nodded, then held Isaac's hand as tightly as he could, as if holding on to what little warmth remained. When the medevac chopper arrived, Frank was lifted first, his wounds worse. Isaac was still breathing then, but by the time the helicopter rose into the gray morning sky, he had gone still. His eyes still open, facing the clouds. Frank Delaney had never been one for long journeys. At 85, and he no longer drove. He didn't use a smartphone, and he hadn't been on a plane since 1972. That morning, Frank Delaney woke up at 4:00 a.m. There was only one thing on his mind: Jefferson Barracks, the place where a promise had been made and finally could be kept. It was still dark when he quietly put on his old military coat, carefully folded the flag flat and tucked it into the inside pocket of a worn leather pouch. On the kitchen table lay a handwritten note: Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery, Plot 57, Row D. Beneath that, 3 simple directions written in blue ink, not printed from Google Maps, but sketched out the week before by a kind young librarian in town. Frank took 2 intercity buses, each ride nearly an hour long. He chose the window seat, spoke to no one, and held the canvas bag tightly in his lap, as if afraid someone might take what he'd carried for a lifetime. At one point, a delay ahead stopped the bus for nearly 20 minutes. Frank quietly glanced at his watch and whispered to himself, "Still on time." When he reached the transfer station, he walked 3 blocks on aching knees, then waited patiently for bus 73, the line that would take him to the cemetery on the city's southern edge. A young man sitting beside him asked, "Where you headed this early, sir?" Frank simply smiled and replied softly, "To visit an old friend." He didn't say more. This wasn't a trip to explain, it was one to complete. There was no camera to document the journey, no family member by his side. Just Frank, his slow and steady steps, and the wind slipping through his collar as he crossed quiet intersections veiled in morning fog. When the final bus pulled to a stop in front of the gates, Frank stood up slowly, gripping the rail with a trembling hand. He stepped down and looked up at the iron arch overhead, Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Beyond that gate, just a few hundred steps away, was the resting place of a friend he had searched for across more than half a lifetime. Frank Delaney arrived at the cemetery gates at exactly 10:17 a.m. The Missouri sky was overcast, not quite raining, but cold enough for the wind to sneak under his coat. He stopped before the black iron fence, gripping the edge of his jacket, eyes scanning the green expanse and its endless rows of white marble stones. Near the entrance, a small security post stood. A young guard, maybe 30 at most, stood in ceremonial uniform, radio on his shoulder, focused on a clipboard as if double-checking a guest list. Frank approached slowly, respectfully. "Good morning, son. I'm here to visit a friend. Plot 57, Row D. May I come in?" The guard looked up, offering a polite but puzzled expression. He scanned his papers and asked, "Do you have military ID, sir? Or written authorization from the cemetery?" Frank hesitated. "I haven't had an ID in years. But I have this letter from Isaac, and this flag." He gently took out an old, faded piece of paper, the ink barely visible with age. Then, from the inside of his coat, he drew out the flag, folded with care and precision, square as the loyalty he had carried for decades. The young guard glanced at it, uncertain. It was the kind of object too ordinary to stop someone, and too sacred to ignore. After a pause, the guard said, "I'm really sorry, sir, but without official documentation, I can't let anyone inside. It's the policy." Frank nodded. Slowly, thoughtfully. No arguing, no protest, just a nod, a little heavier than usual. A couple walked past. The woman whispered something to her husband and glanced at Frank with curiosity. Nearby, a teenage boy stifled a laugh at the sight of the old man's worn-out coat. Some furrowed their brows, some averted their eyes. But no one asked why this man stood there alone in the cold, clutching a flag like it held his entire world. Frank took a step back, turned, and walked to a stone bench just outside the gate. He sat down carefully. His shoulders dropped, not from exhaustion, but from something more familiar. The weight of being forgotten. Up on the hill to the right of the entrance, among sun-drenched rows of gravestones, stood a woman in uniform. She wore a U.S. Air Force officer's jacket, her black cap pulled low over her brow. Her eyes, sharp and alert, followed the scene below in silence. Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Rhodes hadn't come for any official ceremony. She'd taken the morning off to visit her father's grave. Captain Ernest Rhodes, a fighter pilot killed in Laos in 1970. Every year on his birthday, she came alone. No speech, no escort, just a quiet conversation between father and daughter. She had been about to leave when she noticed the scene at the gate, the elderly man in a weathered coat, holding a flag, speaking to the guard. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. Naomi stopped walking, squinting slightly to see better. When Frank reached into his coat and revealed the flag and that old letter, her breath caught. On his sleeve was a patch she hadn't seen in years, a small dragon wrapped around a broken sword. Her heart skipped. That was the insignia of a unit stationed near Khe Sanh. The same one her father had written about in his letters home, the one he'd served with, and the one that included the soldier who had saved his life during an artillery strike. She had been too young then to understand. But as an officer herself, Naomi had often searched for the name of that soldier, the one her father had once called the man who kept his promise, even in hell. His name was Frank Delaney. She inhaled deeply, then turned and headed straight for the gate, her hesitation gone. Naomi didn't know why the old man had come here today. She didn't know whose grave he had found or how far he had traveled to get here. But she knew one thing for certain. That man should not be sitting alone on a cold stone bench. Not today. Not after everything he had done. Naomi Rhodes was not someone who acted on impulse. As a seasoned Air Force officer with deployments in Afghanistan, she was trained to observe, assess, then act. But this time, something deeper moved her. Something beyond logic. What her father used to call the voice of duty. She walked quickly toward a black SUV parked near the officer's lot, pulled out her phone, and tapped a familiar number. Major General Elias Carter, commander of Region 8. The same man who once served alongside her father and, according to an old letter, had been pulled from a shell crater in 1968 by a soldier named Frank Delaney. The call connected after just 2 rings. "Naomi?" the general answered. "Sir, I think I just saw Frank Delaney. There was a pause. Then the sound of a chair creaking on the other end. You're certain? Yes, sir. I saw the unit patch, the folded flag, and his eyes. I'm sure of it. Where is he now? At the front gate of Jefferson Barracks, and they wouldn't let him in. Another long breath, then just 4 words. Give me 5 minutes. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 black military SUVs rolled out of Regional Command Headquarters. No sirens, no fanfare, but hazard lights blinking silently, the way the military moves when things are serious. Naomi stood quietly, still holding her phone, her eyes fixed on the figure sitting alone by the gate. Frank was hunched over the flag in his lap, gently smoothing the corners with care, as if trying to preserve words that had never been spoken aloud. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She knew some people didn't need to be comforted by words. They just needed someone to understand and to act. Then came the low hum of engines, steady and strong. Through the morning fog, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the cemetery entrance. Frank Delaney was still sitting on the stone bench, head lowered, bony hands resting gently on the flag. He didn't know anyone was coming. He wasn't expecting anything, just a quiet moment to honor a friend. Being turned away wasn't new to him. It hurt, yes, but it was familiar. The door of the lead vehicle opened. A tall man stepped out in full uniform. Straight-backed, stern-faced, 4 silver stars gleamed on his shoulders. No introduction needed. Major General Elias Carter. There were no cameras, no speeches. Just a man, the wind, and an old soldier waiting by the gate. As if history had forgotten to call his name. General Carter walked straight to the guard station. The young guard snapped to attention, startled, his hands trembling. "Do you know who that man is?" Carter asked, eyes locked on Frank. The guard stammered, "Sir, I just saw that he didn't have proper documentation." The general nodded, not in anger, but with gravity. Then his voice dropped low, like distant thunder. "That's Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney. He pulled me from a crater at Khe Sanh in '68. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here. None of us would." Frank looked up when he heard his name. His eyes met Carter's. 2 generations, 1 memory. The general walked toward him, came to a stop, and did something no one expected. He raised his hand in a formal salute. A salute not for rank, but for a true hero. Frank froze. His eyes welled up, but no tears fell. He slowly stood, returned the salute, and straightened his back like he had 50 years ago in uniform. From a distance, a few cemetery visitors paused to watch. One by one, they removed their hats, placed hands over hearts, and bowed their heads. They didn't know the full story, but they knew this moment was worth standing still for. There were no plaques, no microphones. But that morning, Jefferson Barracks bore witness to a truth every military cemetery quietly whispers. A soldier is never forgotten. If someone remembers their name, no one urged him. No one had to lead the way. Frank Delaney walked slowly through the cemetery gates, the soles of his old military boots brushing against white gravel. The folded flag rested on his shoulder like a promise still waiting to be fulfilled. Beside him, General Carter and Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Rhodes walked silently. Not ahead, not behind, but with him. At a respectful distance, they passed under tall oak trees, through rows of markers arranged like soldiers standing in formation. Each headstone was the same, white, square, and unadorned. No ranks, no medals, just names, birth dates, death dates, and silence. Finally, they reached Plot 57, Row D. Frank stepped toward the 3rd headstone from the corner and slowly bowed his head. The name was still there, etched quietly into white stone, unadorned and without fanfare. Isaac Monroe CPL, U.S. Marines, 1945 to 1968. He kept his fire. Frank placed his hand on the stone, his thin fingers trembling slightly. His eyes read each line as if for the first time, and also as if he had memorized them long ago. He didn't speak for several minutes. He simply stood there, shoulders slightly bowed, head gently tilted, as if sharing a silent conversation with an old friend. Then, slowly, with the reverence of a soldier, he reached into his coat and took out the flag. He knelt and placed it gently at the base of the grave. The wind gave it a small stir, and then it settled. In a soft, almost whispering voice, Frank said, "I kept my promise, Isaac. A little late, but I kept it." General Carter stood silently, his gaze toward the sky. Naomi lowered her head, gripping her cap in both hands. No music, no gun salute, no taps, and yet the moment felt complete. Among thousands of names today, one was remembered, and one promise, after more than 50 years, was finally fulfilled. The following week, a new bench was installed near the front entrance of Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery. Not flashy, not listed on any visitor's map, but anyone who had heard the story of Frank Delaney knew. It wasn't just another bench. A small bronze plaque on the back read, "For those who returned to keep a promise." No further explanation needed. It wasn't just a place to rest tired legs. It was for those who carried memory, for those who never forgot. Over time, something unspoken became custom. If a veteran stood near that bench, no one else sat down. No signs were posted, just a shared glance, a quiet understanding. Frank returned every year, no escorts, no media. He still rode the bus, still held the same flag, still walked with the same slow steps. But he was never alone again. There was always someone who came to sit beside him. A curious teenager with questions, a fellow veteran with an old promise of his own. The flag was placed at Isaac Monroe's grave each February. Each year, the fabric faded a little more, but the story never did. As for the young guard that day, he wrote a letter of apology to Frank. In it, he said, "I've learned that silence doesn't mean someone has nothing to say. Sometimes it means they're carrying something too important for words. Thank you for showing me that before it was too late." Frank's story spread, not through headlines or breaking news, but through school assemblies, small-town memorials, and quiet nods exchanged between old soldiers who knew what it meant. Maybe not many people remember the name Isaac Monroe as they passed through Jefferson Barracks, but to one man, that name was never forgotten. Not because it was carved in stone, but because it was carried in footsteps, in folded cloth, and in a promise made by a man who didn't need to be asked and could never be replaced. Frank Delaney's story isn't about medals or glory or famous battles. It's about a single promise, honored, even if it took a lifetime to keep. And maybe that's the greatest victory of all. In today's world where everything moves faster, where old values sometimes feel forgotten, maybe we need more people like Frank. The ones who don't need to be seen, only remembered when it matters. Because real honor isn't worn on the outside, it's carried in what you do when no one's watching. If you believe some values never go out of style, like loyalty, respect, and keeping your word, comment one word: value. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, about everyday people doing extraordinary things, don't forget to follow NT Amazing Stories. We've got more to share. Veterans who were nearly forgotten, gratitude that came too late, and quiet, unexpected moments of connection that might just change the way you see the world around you. Who knows? The next video might be a story you didn't even realize you'd been waiting to hear.